In this slide, we will understand how Aristotle explained the origin and development of poetry. He believed that poetry did not appear suddenly. It developed naturally from a basic human quality called mimesis, which means imitation. Let us understand this step by step. The first idea on this slide is the human instinct for imitation, mimesis. According to Aristotle, every human being learns by imitating. A small child learns to speak by copying the words of parents. A student learns to draw by copying the teacher. A singer becomes better by listening to and imitating experienced singers. For example, if a child sees an adult greeting people politely, the child starts greeting others in the same way. This is imitation. Aristotle believed that this natural habit of imitation is the beginning of all art, including poetry. Now Aristotle says that poets were different in their personalities, so poetry developed in two different directions. The first group is called the graver spirits. These were serious-minded poets who admired courage, honesty, sacrifice, and heroism. They liked to write about noble people and great actions. For example, imagine a soldier risking his life to save his country or a doctor working day and night to save patients during a disease outbreak. These are noble actions because they show courage and selflessness. These poets first composed hymns and panegyrics. A hymn is a song written to praise a god or goddess. A panegyric is a poem written to praise a great king, leader, or hero. As poetry became more advanced, these serious poems developed into epic poetry. An epic is a long poem that tells the story of great heroes and important events. A famous example is Homer's Iliad, which tells the story of heroes during the Trojan War. Finally, this tradition developed into tragedy. A tragedy is a serious play where the main character usually faces suffering because of a mistake, fate, or weakness. Although the ending is often sad, it teaches valuable lessons about life. Now let us look at the second group, called the meaner spirits. The word, meaner, here does not mean evil people. It simply means poets who preferred writing about ordinary people, human weaknesses, foolish behavior, and funny situations. Instead of praising heroes, they imitated people's mistakes and bad habits. For example, imagine someone who proudly shows off but keeps making silly mistakes. Such a character makes the audience laugh. These poets wrote invectives, which are poems that criticize or make fun of someone's faults. Many of these poems were written in the iambic meter, a rhythm that sounded close to normal conversation, making it suitable for criticism and humor. Later, these poems developed into parodies, which humorously imitate serious stories. A famous example is Homer's Margits, one of the earliest comic poems, which tells the story of a foolish man. Finally, this tradition developed into comedy. Comedy presents funny situations and ordinary people. Its main purpose is to entertain the audience while also showing human weaknesses in a light-hearted way. Now let us understand the synthesis at the bottom of the slide. Aristotle concludes that poetry naturally divided into two branches because poets had different personalities and interests. Serious poets created tragedy, while humorous poets created comedy. Both forms began from the same human instinct of imitation and gradually developed through many years. So, the main idea of this slide is that all poetry began with imitation, but it grew into tragedy and comedy depending on what the poet chose to imitate. In this slide, Aristotle explains what comedy is and how it is different from tragedy. He believed that both comedy and tragedy are forms of imitation, but they imitate different kinds of people. Let us understand this step by step. First, look at the line in the middle of the slide. It shows three levels of human character. On the left are people who are worse than the average person. In the center are people who are just as we are, meaning ordinary and realistic people. On the right are people who are better than the average person. Aristotle says that different types of literature choose different kinds of characters. Comedy usually presents people who are worse than the average person. This does not mean they are criminals or evil people. It simply means they have funny weaknesses, bad habits, or foolish behavior that make people laugh. For example, imagine a man who is very proud of his intelligence but keeps making silly mistakes. Or imagine someone who lies to impress others, but every lie creates an even funnier problem. These characters are not dangerous. They are simply foolish, and their behavior makes the audience laugh. Now look at the center of the line. This represents realism. Realism shows people exactly as they are in everyday life, with both strengths and weaknesses. For example, a student who studies hard but sometimes gets nervous before an exam is a realistic character because that is how many people are in real life. Now look at the right side. Here we have tragedy and epic. These forms of literature usually present characters who are better than the average person. They are brave, noble, honest, and often perform great actions. For example, a king who sacrifices his own happiness to save his people, or a soldier who risks his life for others, would be suitable characters for tragedy or epic poetry. Now let us understand the most important idea in this slide, which is defining the ridiculous. Aristotle says that comedy imitates only one particular kind of fault, and that fault is called the ridiculous. The ridiculous means a mistake or weakness that is funny but does not cause serious pain or harm. For example, imagine a person wearing two different shoes without noticing it. Everyone laughs because it is harmless. Or imagine someone trying to act very important but accidentally sitting on a chair that breaks. It is funny because no one is seriously hurt. This is different from a serious accident or crime. Those situations cause pain and suffering, so they belong to tragedy, not comedy. The slide also mentions the comic mask used in ancient Greek theatre. The comic mask often looked ugly, strange, or exaggerated, with a large nose, wide mouth, or funny facial expression. However, its purpose was only to make the audience laugh. It did not represent real suffering or serious pain. This shows that comedy focuses on harmless human weaknesses rather than serious problems. So, the main message of this slide is that comedy imitates ordinary people with funny faults and harmless mistakes, while tragedy presents noble people facing serious challenges. Aristotle believed that comedy helps us laugh at human weaknesses without causing pain, making it both entertaining and meaningful. In this slide, Aristotle gives his famous definition of tragedy. This definition is one of the most important ideas in literary criticism because it explains what tragedy is, what it should contain, and what effect it should have on the audience. Let us understand it in a very simple way. First, look at the definition in the center of the slide. Aristotle says that tragedy is the imitation of a serious action that is complete, important, and presented through dramatic performance. It creates feelings of pity and fear, and finally brings about catharsis. This definition may sound difficult, so let us understand every part one by one. 1. Form: dramatic acting, not narrative storytelling. The first point is form. Aristotle says that tragedy is written to be performed on a stage, not simply read as a story. In a novel, the narrator tells us what happens. For example, a novel may say, "The king entered the palace and spoke to his soldiers." But in a tragedy, the audience actually sees the king entering the stage and speaking. The actors perform the events directly in front of the audience. That is why Aristotle says tragedy is dramatic acting, not narrative storytelling. Think of the difference between reading the script of a movie and watching the movie itself. Watching actors perform creates a much stronger emotional effect. Now let us move to the second point. 2. Subject: men better than ourselves. Aristotle says that tragedy usually presents people who are better than ordinary human beings. This does not mean they are perfect. It means they possess qualities such as bravery, wisdom, honesty, leadership, or greatness. For example, a king who sacrifices everything to protect his kingdom, or a leader who risks his own life to save others, is better than the average person because of his noble character. However, these heroes are still human beings. They can make mistakes. In fact, most tragic heroes fall not because they are evil, but because they make one serious mistake in judgment. This makes the audience feel sympathy because they realize that even great people can make mistakes. 3. Language: beautiful and pleasant expression. Now let us understand the third point, language. Aristotle says tragedy should use beautiful and artistic language. This includes rhythm, harmony, and poetic expression. In ancient Greek theatre, actors often spoke in poetic language, and the chorus sang songs with music and rhythm. For example, instead of saying, "The sun has set," a tragic play may say, "The golden light of day has disappeared beyond the western hills." Both sentences express the same idea, but the second one sounds more beautiful and emotional. Aristotle believed that beautiful language makes the audience enjoy the performance while also making the emotions stronger. 4. Function catharsis. Now we come to the most important idea on this slide, catharsis. Catharsis means the emotional purification or emotional release experienced by the audience. While watching tragedy, the audience feels pity for the hero because they see his suffering. At the same time, they feel fear because they realize that similar mistakes or misfortunes could happen to anyone. For example, imagine watching a film where an honest father makes one wrong decision, loses everything, and suffers greatly. You feel pity because he is suffering. You also feel fear because you understand that one mistake can change a person's life. At the end of the story, these emotions are released, and the audience feels mentally calmer, wiser, and emotionally satisfied. This emotional cleansing is called catharsis. According to Aristotle, this is the main purpose of tragedy. Conclusion. So, the main idea of this slide is that a tragedy is not simply a sad story. It is a carefully designed dramatic performance about a noble person facing a serious action. It uses beautiful language, presents events on stage, and finally creates pity and fear, leading the audience to catharsis or emotional purification. This is why Aristotle considered tragedy to be the highest and most powerful form of literature. Aristotle explains that all forms of art are based on mimesis, which means imitation. However, he also says that different arts imitate in different ways. To understand this, Aristotle divides mimesis into 3 parts. 1. The means or medium. 2. The objects or subject. 3. The manner or mode. Let us understand each one very simply. 1. The means, medium, how art imitates. The first question Aristotle asks is, what tools does art use to imitate life? These tools are called the means or medium of art. According to Aristotle, there are 3 main means. The first is rhythm. Rhythm is the pattern of movement or beats. It is mainly used in dance. For example, when dancers perform classical dance, they tell a story through body movements and rhythmic steps without speaking many words. The second is language. Language includes both prose and poetry. Writers use words to express ideas, emotions, and stories. For example, when you read a novel, poem, or drama, language is the main medium. The third is harmony. Harmony means music or melody, usually produced by instruments like the flute or lyre in ancient Greece. For example, when we listen to a song, the music itself creates emotions even before we understand the words. Now Aristotle makes an important observation. He says tragedy combines all 3 means together. A tragic play contains beautiful language, rhythmic speech, and music or songs performed by the chorus. That is why tragedy creates such a powerful emotional experience. Now let us move to the second part. 2. The objects, subject. What art imitates? The second question Aristotle asks is, whom does art imitate? He says literature can present 3 kinds of people. First are people better than ourselves. These are noble, courageous, and respected characters. They are usually found in tragedy. For example, King Oedipus is a powerful ruler who sincerely wants to save his people. Although he makes mistakes, he is still greater than an ordinary person. Second are people equal to ourselves. These are ordinary human beings with both strengths and weaknesses. Many modern novels and realistic films focus on such characters because they resemble everyday people. For example, a school teacher, a shopkeeper, or a college student facing normal life problems are characters equal to ourselves. Third are people worse than ourselves. These characters have funny weaknesses, foolish habits, or silly behavior. They appear mainly in comedy. For example, a lazy servant who always finds excuses to avoid work or a man who boasts about everything but fails at every task makes the audience laugh. So, According to Aristotle, literature chooses different kinds of characters depending on its purpose. Now let us understand the final part. 3. The manner, mode, how the story is presented. The third question Aristotle asks is, how is the story presented to the audience? He says there are two main modes. The first is the narrative mode. In narrative writing, the poet or storyteller tells the story. Sometimes the narrator speaks in his own voice. Sometimes he speaks as one of the characters. Aristotle gives the example of Homer. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer sometimes describes events himself and sometimes lets the characters speak directly. For example, imagine reading a novel where the author says, "The king entered the battlefield." This is narrative. The second is the dramatic mode. Here, the story is not told by a narrator. Instead, actors perform everything directly on the stage. Aristotle gives the example of Sophocles, the great Greek playwright. When we watch a play like Oedipus Rex, we do not hear someone narrating the events. Instead, we see the king speaking, walking, crying, and making decisions before our eyes. This direct performance creates a much stronger emotional impact. Conclusion. So, the main idea of this slide is that Aristotle classifies all literature by asking three simple questions. First, what tools does art use? That is the means, rhythm, language, and harmony. Second, whom does art imitate? That is the objects, people who are better than us, equal to us, or worse than us. Third, how is the story presented? That is the manner, either through narration, like Homer, or through dramatic performance, like Sophocles. This three-part classification became one of Aristotle's greatest contributions to literary theory because it helps us understand and analyze every form of literature in a clear and systematic way. Aristotle explains the 6 essential elements of tragedy. He believed that a tragedy becomes successful only when these 6 elements work together. Look at the picture carefully. It is designed like a Greek temple. Just as a temple stands firmly because every pillar supports it, a tragedy also stands firmly because of these 6 important elements. Aristotle also tells us that these elements are not equally important. He arranges them in order of importance, from the most important to the least important. Let us understand each one. 1. Plot. Mythos, the most important element. The first and most important element is plot. Aristotle calls the plot the life and soul of tragedy. A plot is simply the sequence of events or the story that happens from beginning to end. Aristotle says tragedy is an imitation of action, not of persons. What does this mean? It means the story is more important than the characters themselves. Imagine you are watching a movie with famous actors, but the story is confusing and boring. Even though the actors are excellent, you probably will not enjoy the movie. Now imagine another movie with ordinary actors but a powerful and emotional story. Most people will remember the second movie because the plot is strong. That is exactly what Aristotle means. A good tragedy depends mainly on its plot. 2. Character. Ethos. The second element is character. Character means the qualities and personality of the people in the story. According to Aristotle, a character becomes meaningful when he or she makes moral choices. For example, imagine a king who must choose between saving his own son or saving the entire kingdom. Whatever decision he makes reveals his character. A person's actions show who they truly are. That is why Aristotle says character is revealed through choices. However, even though character is important, Aristotle says it is still less important than the plot, because characters exist mainly to perform the actions of the story. 3. Thought. Dianoia. The third element is thought. Thought means the ideas, messages, wisdom, or truths expressed in the play. In other words, it answers the question, what lesson does this story teach? For example, after watching a tragedy, we may learn that pride can destroy a person's life. Or we may learn that every action has consequences. These ideas make the audience think deeply. That is why Aristotle calls this element thought. 4. Diction. Lexis. The fourth element is diction. Diction means the choice of words and style of language used by the writer. A tragedy should use language that is clear, beautiful, and appropriate to the characters and situation. For example, a king should speak with dignity and respect, while an ordinary servant should speak more simply. Good diction makes conversations natural and emotionally powerful. It also makes the play more enjoyable to hear. 5. Melody. Melos. The fifth element is melody. In ancient Greek theatre, the chorus often sang songs between scenes. These songs included music, rhythm, and harmony. Melody makes the performance more emotional and memorable. Think about modern movies. Sometimes the background music makes us feel happy, frightened, or emotional even before any dialogue is spoken. Similarly, Aristotle believed that music strengthens the emotional effect of tragedy. 6. Spectacle. Opsis. The sixth and final element is spectacle. Spectacle includes everything we can see on the stage. It includes costumes, scenery, lighting, special effects, stage decoration, and visual presentation. For example, a grand palace, colorful costumes, or dramatic lighting all belong to spectacle. However, Aristotle says spectacle is the least artistic element. Why? Because beautiful scenery alone cannot make a tragedy great. Even if a stage looks magnificent, the play will fail if the story is weak. That is why Aristotle says spectacle depends more on the stage designer than on the poet. Conclusion. So, the main message of this slide is that Aristotle arranged the 6 elements of tragedy in order of importance. First comes plot, because it is the heart and soul of the play. Then come character and thought, which give meaning to the story. After that come diction and melody, which make the performance beautiful and emotionally effective. Finally comes spectacle, which adds visual beauty but cannot replace a strong story. Aristotle's most important teaching is this: a tragedy becomes great not because of expensive costumes or famous actors, but because of a well-constructed plot supported by strong characters, meaningful ideas, beautiful language, music, and appropriate stage presentation. We will learn about one of Aristotle's most famous ideas in literary criticism, called the concept of unities. Many students think Aristotle gave 3 strict rules called the unity of action, unity of time, and unity of place. But this is not completely true. Aristotle clearly emphasized only one unity, which is the unity of action. The other 2, unity of time and unity of place, were developed later by Renaissance critics based on their interpretation of Aristotle's ideas. Let us understand each unity one by one. 1. Unity of action. The most important unity. The most important idea for Aristotle is the unity of action. This means that a play should focus on one main story or one central action. Every event in the play should be connected to this main action. Nothing unnecessary should be included. Aristotle says that a tragedy should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning starts the action. The middle develops the action. The end brings the action to a natural conclusion. Think of a bicycle chain. Every link is connected to the next one. If you remove one important link, the bicycle cannot move properly. In the same way, every event in a tragedy must be connected. If one important scene is removed and the story still makes perfect sense, then that scene was unnecessary. For example, imagine a detective story. Every clue helps the detective solve the mystery. If one clue is removed, the solution becomes difficult to understand. This is what Aristotle means by the unity of action. Everything should contribute to one complete story. That is why this unity is shown in the largest circle in the center of the slide. 2. Unity of time. Now let us move to the unity of time. Aristotle observed that many Greek tragedies happened within one day, or roughly one complete cycle of the sun, which means about 24 hours. However, he never said this was an absolute law. He only suggested that shorter periods of time usually make the story more believable and easier for the audience to follow. For example, imagine a movie where everything happens from morning to night. It feels natural because the audience can easily follow the sequence of events. But imagine another movie where one scene is in childhood, the next is 20 years later, and then suddenly it moves back 10 years. The audience may become confused if the transitions are not clear. So Aristotle preferred a shorter time span, but he did not make it a compulsory rule. That is why the slide says it is a guideline, not an iron rule. 3. Unity of place. Now let us understand the unity of place. Many people believe Aristotle said that a play must happen in only one location. Actually, he never clearly stated this in Poetics. This idea was added later by Renaissance critics. They believed that if a play moved from one city to another or from one country to another, it would become less realistic on the stage. So they suggested keeping the entire play in one place. For example, imagine watching a stage play where one scene is in India, the next suddenly moves to Egypt, and then immediately to Rome. In ancient theatres, changing locations quickly was difficult. Therefore, later critics preferred one setting. But remember, this was their interpretation, not Aristotle's original rule. This is one of the most commonly asked questions in literature examinations. If someone asks, did Aristotle create the unity of place? The correct answer is number. It was developed later by Renaissance critics. Conclusion. So, the main message of this slide is that Aristotle strongly emphasized only the unity of action. A tragedy should tell one complete and well-connected story with a clear beginning, middle, and end. The unity of time was only a practical guideline to keep the story within a short period, usually about one day. The unity of place was not Aristotle's rule at all. It was introduced later by Renaissance critics based on their own interpretation of his ideas. Therefore, when studying Aristotle's Poetics, always remember this important fact. The true and essential unity according to Aristotle is the unity of action. The other two unities became famous later but were not explicitly demanded by Aristotle himself.